In this video, I'd like to show you how to propagate elderberry as well as the currant family, specifically blackcurrant. These are very easy plants to propagate, and here in central New York in late winter, early spring, they're still asleep. It's very easy to propagate via hardwood cuttings. I'm going to show you some techniques that are very straightforward, very doable, so stick around. Right in front of me is a really healthy example of Sambucus canadensis, that is the American elder, and this is particularly a varietal called Scotia. But you could do this with wild plants, you could do this with European plants. It works very easily with this whole Sambucus crew. Now, you're not going to even believe this, but here we are in this cold temperate climate. It's about 10 to 12 feet tall. Last year, right around this time, I cut this plant absolutely flush to ground. Yes, this is all last year's growth. So that should give you an idea of how much vitality and vigor this plant has, even in a cold climate. So they'll root readily from cuttings. Let me show you what a cutting actually is. Bear with me if you're already really familiar with this. This is definitely a beginner's video. But you can see in front of me, these are buckets of cuttings that I've prepped. We're a small nursery, so we collect hardwood dormant cuttings and we keep them cool and moist in sawdust. You could do this too if you wanted to collect cuttings one day and then go out and plant another. These are frozen and thawed. They're not particularly sensitive to that. You can see they're moist at the bottom. And what we've done is used pruners to go ahead and take cuttings. For elder, you really only need a set of buds at the top. If you have them at the bottom, that's great, but it's not critical. Everywhere you see a raised bump is somewhere that this plant is willing to root. You can see how big that one is. You can also see that I have some skinnier shoots. You don't want to go with something 1 or 2 inches, but even this short, this is about 4 or 5 inches, this will root very easily. Let's say you have an annual garden. It's pretty clean, nice, rich soil. It's grown good vegetables or good annuals or flowers for you last year. You can dedicate a small section of it to be a nursery this year. So let's say you ordered elderberry cuttings from us or another nursery. You might have handfuls of plants like these or cuttings. Of course, I'm going with the buds facing up. A good nursery will give you that orientation, or you should make note of it as you take your cuttings. Now, because we have nice, loose, soft soil, it's easy to push these in. But a little shovel work beforehand to loosen and decompact soil, maybe add some sand or rotted leaves, even some perlite, if that's what you want. This last one's a little harder, but because it's bigger, I can use my body weight to push it in. They're not particularly sensitive. You'll notice I put them pretty closely. They're about 4 inches apart. In that configuration, they'll root this spring. They'll grow beautifully, they'll be a little intertwined, and we can dig them in the fall when they're dormant with huge root systems. Let me show you what it looks like a year later. Fast forward 1 year, and this is what you will probably get. We don't really water. We have a pretty moist site, so that's helpful, but if you don't want to have to water a lot or fuss with weeds, just mulch them very, very deeply, and as they grow, mulch up the stems, and they'll root into that as well. There's new shoots forming at the bottom. I broke one on the way of digging this out. No worries, there's more where that came from. And this, in fact, is actually Scotia. So this is about a 2-foot tall rooted cutting, ready to go out into the field. Very easy to transplant at this point. And that's all from 1 year on 4 to 6 inch spacing between cuttings. So simple in a garden. Well, that's all well and good if you've got a nice garden space. But what if you've got a big elder that you have access to that you want to cut back, or someone's given you permission to take cuttings, and you want to go ahead and just straight plant them in a field? Maybe you want to guerrilla plant them in a town you live in, something fun like that. How do we go about that? So here's one branch I snipped down into pieces that are good for field planting. You notice they're a little taller. I'm not going to go for a 6-foot cutting. There's a real curve to this, a sweet spot right around 1 foot to 2 feet, much beyond that, and they'll leaf out too much without enough roots. You really want a high ratio of what's below ground to above ground. And the fatter the stem, the easier it is to put a gloved hand on top and push it into the ground. So I'll take these 4, 5, and show you how I can plant these into our lawn. So here we are in the lawn. Let's say you've got a mowed lawn you're ready to replace with actual food, something actually meaningful and useful for you and your family, some medicine for your community. Early in the spring, most of us have pretty moist lawns, moist areas where the grasses grow, and it's pretty easy to push these in. Now, you could use a shovel. In fact, I'll show that in a moment, but very simply, that ought to become an elder. You can see the fatter the stick, the easier it is to push in. If I did it with a shovel, it'd be a little easier. Now, the follow-up for this would be to apply a 5-gallon bucket of compost or aged wood chips around this elder. And as it starts to root, as it starts to grow, the lawn early in the season will put up some competition. So you can either mow close to it, just be careful you don't nick the plant. Better yet, let the grass grow, get tall, pin it down facing outward. You can step it over and pin more wood chips on top. The more you mulch, the stronger the elder gets. Don't keep a tightly mowed lawn all season. Keep going with deposition. You see, all of our gardens are all about adding and adding and adding. Soil gets so rich that weeds, so to speak, really aren't an issue. It's all plants we want. Maybe you've got a tougher section of lawn or tighter soil, drier soil. You can use a shovel. Bear with me, I'm doing this in a weird way. But I'll step down on that, take a more fragile cutting. And normally, if I'm not holding a camera, it's much easier. But I'll pry that forward, slip that in. Let's say you break the branch, or in this case, I cracked that. That's fine. Either trim it off or just leave it. The good news is everything I just showed you for elderberry works equally well for currants. The exception that the currant stems are a little bit smaller or thinner, more fragile, and so you generally want a few buds on there. But start anywhere from 6 inches all the way up. Take old prunings that need to be done anyway, and those are great propagation material. And black currant roots the best, so start with that. Red currant, white currant, pink currant will root, but not as incredibly well. But give them all a shot. Let me show you some examples of what it looks like after a few years. 10 or 15 black currant cuttings 3 years later. It's now such a thicket, and since I've added mulch all around it, I've got around 100 or so rooted plants that can be dug up, teased apart, snipped apart, and planted out to an actual orchard. And of course, this works with willow very well. So here's Bretensis and Golden Curls curly willow. Same process. You can see the old sticks I stuck 2 or 3 years ago. They've grown beautifully, and I can take tons of cuttings and keep copying. Here's an elder cutting in front of me. You can see the thickest part of the stem was what I stuck in the ground. That was a long one about 2 years ago. This soil's very rich and very moist, so it can accommodate such a big cutting. I'll have to dig this up and move it. I don't want it to take over all the gardens. Black currant cutting put in 4 years ago, and every time it grew, I pinned it down with rocks, added mulch on top, and now we've got a whole thicket of amazing cultivar black currants. More elders in the hedgerow. I actually stuck these at a very steep angle to the north. 1, 2, 3, 4. It rooted, they rooted, and all of them sent up these really vigorous new shoots to the south. We've got a pretty substantial hedgerow. It'll block the road within the year, though it's 2 years old. They really go quick. If you have access to some elderberry, currants, or willows, don't overthink it. You can take cuttings as long as they're asleep. If they've budded out or leafed a little, rip some of the leaves off, make sure you water them. But this is really easy, it's really straightforward. You can do this, you can plant a ton of plants. I mean hundreds of plants in a day, no problem. Get some folks together, take over some lawns, fill them out with food and medicine. Thanks for watching.